across history and geography, groups of individuals have united under ideologies so extreme they have left an indelible mark of fear, tragedy, and intrigue. These are the cults that took control of lives, shaped beliefs, and pushed the boundaries of morality. Today, we explore 25 world's most dangerous cult groups you never knew existed. Brace yourself as we unravel each chilling story one by one. 1. The Church of Scientology. In the heart of Hollywood's glitz and glamour lies an organization cloaked in secrecy and controversy, the Church of Scientology. Known for its celebrity adherence and relentless public relations campaigns, this organization claims to offer a pathway to spiritual enlightenment through its teachings and practices. But behind the polished exterior, a much darker narrative unfolds. The Church of Scientology was established in 1953 by L. Ron Hubbard, a prolific science fiction writer. Hubbard introduced Scientology as a religion that offers a precise path, leading to a complete and certain understanding of one's true spiritual nature and one's relationship to self, family, groups, mankind, all life forms, the material universe, the spiritual universe, and the Supreme Being. Central to Scientology's teachings is the concept of the Thetan, which refers to the immortal spiritual being that is the true self of every individual. A cornerstone of Scientology practice is auditing, a one-on-one session between a Scientologist and an auditor. During these sessions, individuals aim to confront and overcome spiritual impediments, thereby achieving greater self-awareness and spiritual freedom. The process utilizes a device known as the electropsychometer, or E-meter, which measures the electrical resistance of the individual skin as they respond to questions. Scientologists believe that the E-meter helps locate areas of spiritual distress or engrams, traumatic memories, that auditing seeks to resolve. Organizational structure and the C organization. The Church of Scientology operates through a complex hierarchy, with the C organization, Sea Org, serving as its religious order for the most dedicated members. Established in 1967 by Hubbard himself, the Sea Org is composed of individuals who have committed their lives to the service of Scientology, often signing symbolic billion-year contracts to signify their eternal commitment. Members of the Sea Org live communally and are responsible for the management and dissemination of Scientology's teachings worldwide. Despite its claims of spiritual enlightenment, the Church of Scientology has been embroiled in numerous controversies over the years. One of the most significant was Operation Snow White in the 1970s, a large-scale infiltration and theft operation targeting government agencies, with the aim of purging unfavorable records about Scientology and Hubbard. The operation led to the conviction of several high-ranking Scientologists, including Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard. Additionally, the church has faced allegations of abusive practices within the Sea Org. Former members have reported being subjected to harsh disciplinary measures, including confinement in a facility known as the Hole, where they endured degrading conditions and psychological abuse. These accounts have been corroborated by multiple ex-Scientologists, though the Church vehemently denies such practices. Personal testimonies from former members provide a glimpse into the inner workings of Scientology. Danielle Chamberlain, who joined the Sea Org at the age of 12, recounts being subjected to child abuse, including being locked in the ship's hull and witnessing instances of extreme punishment. Her defiance eventually led to her release, and she left Scientology for good at 19. Another account comes from Valeska Paris, who reported being imprisoned on board the Free Winds, a Scientology cruise ship, to prevent her from leaving the church. She claimed her passport was confiscated, and she was held against her will for 12 years, forced into manual labor, and unable to leave the ship without an escort for 6 years. The Church of Scientology has denied these claims. The Church of Scientology's relationship with the media has been contentious. Investigative journalists who have reported critically on the Church have alleged harassment and surveillance. For instance, Richard Behar, who authored a Time magazine cover story titled The Thriving Cult of Greed and Power, claimed he was subjected to Scientology's fair game tactics, including being followed and having his personal life investigated. Despite these controversies, Scientology maintains a presence in popular culture, partly due to its association with high-profile celebrities. Actors like Tom Cruise and John Travolta are among its most famous adherents, often promoting the church's teachings. However, other celebrities such as Leah Remini have left the church and become outspoken critics, alleging manipulation and abuse within the organization. The Church of Scientology has been involved in numerous legal battles worldwide, often concerning its tax-exempt status and allegations of criminal behavior. In the United States, the Internal Revenue Service granted Scientology tax-exempt status in 1993, recognizing it as a religion. This decision came after years of litigation and is still a subject of debate among critics who argue that the organization operates more like a business than a religious institution. Internationally, several countries have scrutinized Scientology's practices. In Germany, for example, the government considers Scientology a commercial enterprise with totalitarian tendencies, leading to surveillance by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. Similarly, in France, the Church has faced convictions for fraud, with courts labeling it a dangerous cult. The Church of Scientology presents itself as a pathway to spiritual enlightenment, offering tools and teachings aimed at personal betterment. However, the numerous allegations of abuse, manipulation, and illegal activities paint a more complex and troubling picture. The personal accounts of former members, combined with investigative journalism and legal scrutiny, suggest that behind its polished facade, Scientology harbors practices that have caused significant harm to individuals and families. As we continue to explore the world's most dangerous cults, we turn our attention to the next group on our list, whose blend of esoteric beliefs and tragic events has left an indelible mark on history. Number 2. Order of the Solar Temple. As history has shown, the allure of secret societies has always been potent. Some seek refuge in their promises of salvation, while others are lured by enigmatic rituals and esoteric knowledge. But what happens when a group spirals out of control, leaving a legacy of devastation and unanswered questions? Enter the Order of the Solar Temple, a sect whose name evokes ancient mysticism, yet whose actions revealed a horrifying descent into violence and tragedy. The origins of the order, founded in Switzerland in 1984 by Joseph Di Mambro and Luc Jouret, the Order of the Solar Temple claimed to draw its inspiration from the medieval Knights Templar. This connection to an ancient and legendary order of warriors gave the group an air of legitimacy, appealing to those enamored with mysticism and chivalric traditions. Di Mambro, a charismatic orator, and Jure, a homeopathic healer with a commanding presence, combined their talents to recruit followers from France, Switzerland, and Canada. The cult promoted a belief system that blended Christian mysticism, New Age philosophy, and apocalyptic predictions. Members were told they were part of an elect group destined to save the world and ascend to a higher spiritual plane. To this end, the group conducted secretive rituals steeped in symbolism, creating an atmosphere that was as compelling as it was foreboding. The Order of the Solar Temple's teachings revolved around the belief that the Earth was on the brink of destruction. Di Mambro and Jure claimed they had access to esoteric knowledge that would guide their followers to safety. A celestial haven on the star Sirius. Members participated in elaborate ceremonies, during which they donned robes and chanted prayers, believing these rituals would prepare them for their eventual ascension. These ceremonies were not merely theatrical. They were designed to reinforce loyalty. Initiates paid exorbitant sums of money for the privilege of participation, with some donating their life savings. Di Mambro allegedly used holographic projections and other tricks to convince members that they were witnessing divine phenomena, further cementing their belief in the leader's spiritual authority. The order's facade began to crumble in the early 1990s. Financial mismanagement, infighting among members, and growing skepticism about Di Mambro's claims weakened the group's cohesion. When one member questioned the leader's motives, they were ostracized, an act that hinted at the leader's desperation to maintain control. In 1994, the group's apocalyptic beliefs took a deadly turn. Di Mambro became convinced that the birth of a child within the cult was a threat to their mission, as the infant was deemed the Antichrist. This chilling prophecy led to the infant's murder in Quebec, a harbinger of the horrors to come. Later that year, in a series of events that stunned the world, 53 members of the order were found dead in Switzerland and Canada. Many had been shot or poisoned, their bodies arranged in ceremonial patterns. Fires consumed their properties, obliterating evidence and leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Di Mambro and Jure were among the deceased, but their deaths did little to unravel the mystery of their final days. In the wake of the 1994 tragedy, the world was left grappling with the motivations behind the mass deaths. Some speculated that the members had willingly participated in a ritualistic transition, believing they would ascend to Sirius. Others argued that the deaths were orchestrated by the leaders, who sought to maintain their authority even in death. Further deaths occurred in 1995 and 1997, with additional members of the cult taking their own lives in eerily similar circumstances. These incidents reinforced the perception that the Order of the Solar Temple was one of the most dangerous cults in modern history, a group whose influence extended beyond the grave. The Order's legacy endures as a cautionary tale about the power of charismatic leadership and the dangers of unchecked belief. Even today, remnants of the cult reportedly remain active, with several hundred adherents continuing to practice its teachings in secrecy. Testimonies from survivors and former members provide haunting insights into the cult's operations. One former initiate, speaking under the pseudonym Claire, described the psychological grip the leaders had on their followers. "You were made to feel chosen," she said. "They convinced you that the outside world was corrupt and that they were your only path to salvation." Another former member recounted the elaborate deceptions orchestrated by Di Mambro. "He created illusions that we thought were miracles. He played God, and we believed him," the member revealed in an interview. Such accounts underscore the manipulative tactics that ensnared members in a web of devotion and fear. The story of the Order of the Solar Temple is a sobering reminder of how easily ideals can be manipulated to serve darker agendas. The group's tragic end raises profound questions about the nature of faith, loyalty, and the human capacity for self-delusion. As we turn the page to the next chapter, we confront another cult whose influence reached deep into the psyche of its followers and left an indelible mark on history. Number 3. True Russian Orthodox Church, Heavenly Jerusalem. In the snowy expanse of Russia, where isolation and faith intertwine, a small sect emerged with beliefs so extreme that they shocked even the most devout of Orthodox communities. This group, known as the True Russian Orthodox Church, or Heavenly Jerusalem, sought divine salvation not in cathedrals or monasteries, but in the cold, dark depths of the earth. What drove these men and women to retreat into caves, forsaking the light of day? What fear or fervor compels people to embrace such isolation, severing all ties with the world above? The group was founded by Pyotr Kuznetsov, a self-proclaimed prophet who claimed he had been chosen to prepare humanity for the apocalypse. Kuznetsov, who suffered from untreated mental health issues, believed that he was divinely inspired to lead a select few to salvation. His teachings deviated sharply from those of mainstream Russian Orthodoxy, incorporating conspiracy theories and apocalyptic predictions that painted modern society as inherently evil. Kuznetsov's followers were ordinary people, teachers, farmers, and homemakers, who found solace in his words during times of personal or societal turmoil. They viewed him as a beacon of truth in a world they believed was overrun by sin and corruption. Credit cards, barcodes, and even consumer goods were seen as tools of the devil, symbols of humanity's descent into moral decay. In 2007, Kuznetsov instructed his followers to retreat into a cave near the remote village of Nikolskoye. There, approximately 30 members of the sect began their vigil, preparing for the end of the world, which Kuznetsov predicted would occur in May 2008. The cave was cold, damp, and perilous, but to the group, it represented a sacred refuge, a place where they could await divine judgment, free from the contamination of the outside world. Why would anyone willingly endure such harsh conditions? For the members of the Heavenly Jerusalem sect, the answer lay in faith. They believed that enduring suffering was a test of their devotion, a necessary step toward spiritual purity. They were so committed to their isolation that they threatened to take their own lives if authorities attempted to remove them. Their resolve raises a question for us all. How far would you go for your beliefs? At what point does devotion transform into delusion? As the months dragged on, the group's presence in the cave became a growing concern for local authorities and villagers. Reports began to surface of children living among the sect members, their health deteriorating in the uninhabitable conditions. Efforts to negotiate with the group were met with hostility, as Kuznetsov's followers accused outsiders of trying to sabotage their divine mission. Kuznetsov himself, notably, did not join his followers in the cave. Instead, he remained above ground, offering sporadic guidance while living in relative comfort. His absence from the cave fueled speculation about his true intentions. Was he a deluded believer, or had he deliberately manipulated his followers for personal gain? The stalemate continued for months, with authorities hesitant to intervene directly for fear of provoking a mass suicide. The tension grew unbearable as the world watched, waiting to see whether faith or reason would prevail. In the spring of 2008, the situation reached a breaking point. Melting snow and heavy rains caused the cave to begin collapsing, threatening the lives of those inside. Faced with imminent danger, several members emerged voluntarily, their resolve shaken by the physical and emotional toll of their ordeal. The final holdouts were forcibly evacuated after authorities deemed the cave unsafe. What they discovered inside was both tragic and haunting. The cave was littered with makeshift beds, food supplies, and religious icons. The group's desperation was evident in every corner, a stark testament to the human cost of blind devotion. 2 members had perished during the vigil, their bodies left behind as grim reminders of the sect's unwavering commitment. Kuznetsov was later detained and placed in a psychiatric hospital, deemed unfit to stand trial. His followers, though disillusioned, struggled to reintegrate into society, their faith shaken but not entirely abandoned. For some, the collapse of the cave marked the end of a dark chapter. For others, it was merely the beginning of a lifelong struggle to reconcile their beliefs with reality. The stories of those who escaped the cave provide a sobering glimpse into the sect's inner workings. One survivor described the suffocating atmosphere of fear and paranoia that dominated their lives underground. Every day felt like a battle between life and death, she recalled. We were told that to leave the cave was to condemn our souls, but staying felt like a slow descent into madness. A local villager who witnessed the group's emergence from the cave described the scene as heartbreaking. They looked like ghosts, he said, thin, pale, and broken. It was hard to believe these were the same people who had gone in with such conviction. These accounts force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the power of belief and the lengths to which people will go to find meaning in their lives. How do we draw the line between faith and fanaticism? And what happens to those who cross it? The story of the Heavenly Jerusalem sect serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked religious zeal. It highlights the vulnerability of individuals who, in their search for purpose, become susceptible to manipulation by charismatic leaders. But it also raises broader questions about our collective responsibility to recognize and address the warning signs of extremism. The cave may have collapsed, but the lessons of this story remain as solid as stone. As we prepare to turn the page to another chapter, one can't help but wonder, what compels humanity to seek salvation in the most extreme and perilous ways? Number 4. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. In the lush rolling hills of Uganda, where rural life thrives under the vast African sky, a religious group emerged with a promise of divine salvation and eternal peace. But promises are dangerous when wielded by those with unchecked power. This group, known as the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, began with fervent devotion but ended in a cataclysm of death and despair that left an entire nation grappling for answers. What does it take to follow someone who claims to speak for God? How does faith become a weapon? And what happens when salvation turns into destruction? The movement was founded in the late 1980s in the Kanungu district of Uganda by a group of charismatic leaders, including Credonia Murinde, a former prostitute turned prophetess, and Joseph Kibweteri, a former politician. Together, they presented themselves as chosen messengers of the Virgin Mary, claiming to have received divine revelations about the end of the world. Their teachings were rooted in strict adherence to the Ten Commandments, which they proclaimed were humanity's last hope for salvation. Members were told to reject material possessions, live ascetically, and prepare for the apocalypse, which the leaders predicted would arrive with the dawn of the new millennium. At its height, the movement had thousands of followers, many of whom sold their belongings and donated their life savings to the group. They believed they were securing a place in paradise. But as history has shown, blind faith often paves the way for exploitation. Life within the movement was rigid and unforgiving. Members were forbidden from speaking during the day except for prayers, and were required to fast regularly. The leaders emphasized that any deviation from the commandments would result in eternal damnation. Their strict rules created an atmosphere of fear and compliance, where questioning authority was unthinkable. Eyewitnesses and former members have described a culture of extreme control. We were taught that the outside world was corrupt and that only through the movement could we be saved, said one survivor. It felt like every moment of our lives was being watched, judged, and controlled. How much control are you willing to surrender for the promise of salvation? At what point does devotion become subjugation? As January 1st, 2000 approached, anticipation within the movement reached a fever pitch. The leaders had declared that this date marked the end of the world, the moment when the faithful would ascend to heaven. Members prepared themselves with fervent prayers and rituals, their minds focused on the promise of divine reward. But when the new millennium arrived and the world did not end, doubt began to creep into the hearts of the followers. Some started questioning the leaders, asking why their prophecy had failed. In response, the leaders doubled down, announcing that the true apocalypse would occur on March 17th, 2000. This time they said there would be no mistake. On March 17th, hundreds of followers gathered in a church built specifically for the event. They were instructed to dress in their best clothing, as if attending a wedding. The leaders assured them that this would be the night they would meet their Maker. What followed was an unspeakable tragedy. Witnesses reported seeing the church locked from the outside and set ablaze. The flames consumed everything within, killing over 500 people trapped inside. The leaders had transformed their promised ascension into a horrifying massacre. When authorities investigated, they discovered mass graves at other movement properties, bringing the death toll to over 700. Many of these victims had been poisoned or strangled in the weeks leading up to the fire. The scale of the atrocity shocked the nation and the world. The leaders of the movement vanished in the wake of the massacre. While some believe they perished in the fire, Others suggest they escaped and have been living in hiding ever since. Their motives remain a subject of speculation. Were they true believers who acted out of misguided faith? Or were they calculating manipulators who orchestrated the deaths to cover up their crimes? For the survivors and the families of the victims, the scars run deep. We trusted them with our lives, and they betrayed us in the worst way, said one relative. The tragedy has left an enduring mark on Uganda, serving as a grim reminder of the dangers of blind faith and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority. The story of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human condition. Why do we place so much trust in those who claim divine authority? How do we protect ourselves and our communities from those who exploit faith for their own ends? And most importantly, what can we learn from such a horrific chapter in history to ensure it is never repeated? In another part of the world, a different group of followers awaited their own doomsday prophecy. Their leader's vision involved not fire, but a toxic gas that would leave the world reeling. Number 5. Aum Shinrikyo Operation. Japan's descent into darkness, the neon-lit streets of Tokyo bustling with life and modernity, once bore witness to an unspeakable terror that forever changed the nation's perception of safety. Beneath the surface of one of the world's most technologically advanced societies, a shadow grew, a shadow forged by paranoia, manipulation, and fanaticism. This was Aum Shinrikyo, the cult that weaponized faith and science to devastating effect. How does a movement rooted in spirituality evolve into an instrument of mass destruction? And how did its leader convince thousands to surrender their morality for his vision? Aum Shinrikyo was founded in 1984 by Shoko Asahara, a partially blind yoga instructor with aspirations of spiritual and political dominance. Born Chizuo Matsumoto, Asahara claimed to have attained enlightenment during a trip to the Himalayas. Upon his return, he began teaching a blend of Hindu and Buddhist philosophies, infused with apocalyptic Christian prophecies and elements of New Age mysticism. Asahara's teachings gained traction among Japan's disillusioned youth, engineers, scientists, and academics who sought meaning in a fast-paced, materialistic society. What began as a yoga and meditation group quickly transformed into a sprawling religious organization. By the late 1980s, Aum Shinrikyo had amassed tens of thousands of followers in Japan and abroad, and Asahara had declared himself a living deity. Why do people gravitate toward leaders who claim to hold all the answers? Is it the promise of certainty in an uncertain world, or is it something more insidious, a subtle manipulation of our deepest fears and desires? Central to Aum Shinrikyo's ideology was the belief in an imminent apocalypse brought about by a global war. Asahara prophesied that only his followers would survive this catastrophic event and inherit a purified world. To prepare for this doomsday, Aum began stockpiling weapons, manufacturing chemical agents, and even experimenting with biological warfare. Behind the scenes, the cult operated like a state within a state. It had laboratories, weapon production facilities, and even a biotechnology division. Asahara's vision extended beyond spirituality. He sought political power, running for office in Japan's parliamentary elections in 1990. When his party failed spectacularly, the rejection seemed to solidify his conviction that society was corrupt and deserved to be destroyed. What drives a person to escalate from spiritual guidance to plotting mass annihilation. At what point does the pursuit of power overshadow the values a movement claims to uphold? The world would come to know Aum Shinrikyo not for its esoteric teachings, but for an act of terror that remains etched in history. On March 20th, 1995, during Tokyo's bustling morning rush hour, Aum operatives released sarin gas, a highly toxic nerve agent, into the city's subway system. Commuters, oblivious to the danger, boarded trains that became chambers of horror. As the gas spread, victims began collapsing, gasping for air, their bodies convulsing in agony. The attack killed 13 people and injured over 5,000, leaving survivors with long-term neurological damage. The world was horrified, not just by the act itself, but by its methodical execution, which revealed the extent of Aum's resources and planning. In the aftermath, Japanese authorities launched one of the largest manhunts in the nation's history. Raids on Aum's compounds uncovered a nightmarish arsenal: sarin production facilities, stockpiles of chemical precursors, and evidence of experiments on both animals and humans. The scale of their operations stunned investigators. It was clear that the Tokyo subway attack was only a fraction of what the group had planned. Shoko Asahara was arrested in May 1995, along with several high-ranking members. Their trial, which lasted over a decade, exposed the depths of the cult's depravity, including assassinations, forced confinements, and experiments on unwilling participants. Asahara was eventually sentenced to death, a sentence carried out in 2018. Does justice feel complete when the architect of such devastation is punished? Or do the scars left behind, both physical and emotional, linger far longer than any court's verdict? Survivors of the sarin gas attack have shared harrowing accounts of that fateful day. One commuter, a young office worker at the time, described the moment he realized something was terribly wrong. "I saw people collapsing around me. My eyes burned, my chest tightened, and I thought, is this how I'm going to die?" Another survivor, a train operator, recounted the courage it took to guide passengers to safety, despite being exposed to the toxic gas himself. "I knew I had to stay calm, but inside, I was terrified. Every second felt like an eternity." These personal stories serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable terror. Today, Aum Shinrikyo continues to haunt Japan. Though the organization was formally disbanded, splinter groups like Aleph and Hikari no Wa have emerged, attempting to distance themselves from Asahara's legacy while retaining elements of his teachings. The Japanese government monitors these groups closely, wary of the potential for history to repeat itself. The story of Aum Shinrikyo is a stark reminder of how the pursuit of utopia can lead to unspeakable acts. It forces us to question the limits of faith and the ethical boundaries of power. How do we guard against those who seek to manipulate belief for destructive ends? And how do we ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten? In the next story, we step into the eerie confines of an Australian cult whose leader sought to create a master race. Their vision was no less extreme, and their methods no less horrifying. Number 6. The Family. Australia's darkest cult. Amid the idyllic landscapes of Australia, where sprawling beaches and vast outback stretch as far as the eye can see, there existed a disturbing undercurrent, one that thrived under the guise of spiritual enlightenment and communal harmony. This was the Family, a cult led by a woman who believed she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. But what began as a movement of purported love and salvation unraveled into a web of deceit, manipulation, and profound suffering. What kind of devotion makes parents surrender their children? And how does one person command such unquestioning loyalty that it defies the bonds of family and common sense? The family was the brainchild of Anne Hamilton Byrne, a yoga teacher whose serene demeanor masked an insatiable hunger for power. In the mid-1960s, she partnered with Rainer Johnson, a parapsychologist with a keen interest in Eastern mysticism. Together, they formed what they initially called the Great White Brotherhood, a spiritual group that combined elements of Christianity, Eastern philosophy, and doomsday prophecy. Hamilton Byrne's charisma was magnetic. She convinced her followers that she was the Messiah, a living embodiment of divine truth. Her teachings emphasized discipline, spiritual purity, and the coming of an apocalyptic event that only her followers would survive. She described herself as both a nurturing mother figure and a spiritual savior, earning unwavering loyalty from her disciples. But what happens when faith crosses the line into fanaticism? How does one woman convince ordinary people to relinquish their most sacred responsibilities, the care and protection of their children? The family's headquarters, a sprawling property known as Kai Lama, became a fortress of secrecy. Inside its walls, Hamilton Byrne orchestrated her vision of creating a master race. She believed that by carefully selecting and raising children under her guidance, she could create enlightened beings, capable of leading humanity into a new era. Over the years, the family amassed a collection of 28 children, many obtained through questionable means. Some were given up willingly by devoted followers, while others were acquired through falsified adoption papers. In some cases, single mothers were coerced into surrendering their infants, believing they were offering them a life of spiritual fulfillment. Inside Kai Lama, the children were subjected to a strict regimen. They wore identical clothing, their hair dyed platinum blonde to create an ethereal appearance, and were fed a vegetarian diet. They addressed Hamilton Byrne as Mama, and her word was law. Could you imagine growing up without knowing who your real parents are, or being told that your very existence depends on obeying a woman who claims to be divine? Hamilton Byrne's serene facade concealed a darker reality. The children were not just disciplined, they were terrorized. Survivors have recounted being beaten, starved, and subjected to psychological torment. Punishments were severe, often meted out for minor infractions or imagined slights. The goal, it seemed, was not just obedience, but total subjugation. Even more disturbingly, the children were regularly administered sedatives, including LSD, as part of their spiritual education. These drug-induced sessions were meant to break down their individuality and reinforce their dependence on Hamilton Byrne. One survivor later described the experience as a living nightmare, where every aspect of their existence was controlled. What kind of environment must exist for such abuses to go unnoticed for years? And how do individuals justify such actions in the name of faith? By the late 1980s, cracks began to appear in the family's seemingly impenetrable structure. Former members who had escaped the cult began speaking out, sharing their harrowing experiences with authorities. These testimonies, combined with persistent efforts by investigative journalists, brought the family under scrutiny. In 1987, a police raid on Kai Lama exposed the horrifying conditions in which the children were living. The raid resulted in their rescue and the beginning of a long legal battle against Hamilton Byrne and her inner circle. Although she was charged with fraud and conspiracy, Hamilton Byrne managed to avoid more serious charges related to child abuse due to a lack of direct evidence. How does justice reconcile with such atrocities when the full extent of the harm remains hidden behind a wall of silence? The voices of survivors paint a vivid picture of life inside the family. One former member recalled how they were trained to suppress all emotions, especially fear and anger. We were told that Mama was infallible, and if we doubted her, we would be damned forever, they said. It took years for me to unlearn that fear. Another survivor, who escaped as a teenager, described the moment they realized the extent of the manipulation. She made us believe that the outside world was dangerous, that no one out there could be trusted. It wasn't until I left that I understood she was the real danger. These personal stories offer a glimpse into the psychological toll of living under Hamilton Byrne's control, a toll that many survivors continue to grapple with to this day. Anne Hamilton Byrne died in 2019, but the scars left by her cult remain. The children she manipulated have grown into adults, many of whom still bear the emotional and psychological wounds of their upbringing. For them, the road to recovery is long and fraught with challenges. The story of the family serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of those seeking meaning and belonging. It forces us to question how easily power can be abused under the guise of spiritual guidance. More importantly, it compels us to remain vigilant against those who prey on the desperate and the trusting. As the last remnants of this tragic tale linger, we turn our attention to yet another group whose pursuit of salvation led them down a dangerous path. This time, the setting is the United States, and the story centers around a group whose truth-telling rituals spiraled into a terrifying legacy. Number 7. Synanon, the rise and fall of America's most dangerous rehabilitation program. In the vibrant cultural upheaval of 1950s, America, where movements of self-discovery clashed with societal norms, one group emerged under the guise of hope and healing. Synanon began as a sanctuary for those grappling with addiction, offering a path to recovery in a world that often ostracized them. But beneath the promises of redemption and community lay a darker ambition, one that would transform this seemingly benevolent organization into one of the most dangerous and controlling cults in American history. How does an organization that claims to save lives become a harbinger of manipulation and violence? And what compels people to stay even as the walls of trust begin to crumble around them? Synanon was founded in 1958 by Charles Dederick, a charismatic but deeply flawed man who had struggled with alcohol addiction himself. Dederick envisioned a radical approach to treatment, one that rejected traditional methods in favor of group therapy and communal living. His philosophy centered on the game, an intense and often confrontational truth-telling session designed to break down individuals' defenses and expose their deepest vulnerabilities. Initially, Synanon garnered widespread praise. It attracted not only addicts, but also those seeking a sense of purpose and belonging. The program's success stories seemed undeniable, and its innovative methods drew the attention of medical professionals and celebrities alike. Synanon expanded rapidly, establishing compounds across California and amassing a devoted following. But as the group grew, so too did Dederick's ego and authoritarian tendencies. What happens when a leader's vision becomes absolute, leaving no room for dissent or accountability? By the 1960s, Synanon had declared itself a religion, a move that allowed it to claim tax-exempt status while solidifying Dederick's position as an infallible leader. Members were required to devote their lives entirely to the group, renouncing personal wealth, relationships, and autonomy. Families were split apart, with children placed in communal care and spouses separated to avoid distractions. Synanon's rigid structure and Dederick's increasingly erratic behavior created an environment of fear and obedience. The game, once a tool for self-reflection, became a weapon of control, used to humiliate and punish dissenters. Members were subjected to hours-long sessions where they were berated, mocked, and coerced into compliance. Could you withstand such psychological pressure, knowing that the alternative meant ostracism and isolation? At what point does loyalty to a cause become a prison? As Synanon's influence grew, its tactics became more aggressive. Members who attempted to leave were labeled as splittees and subjected to harassment and threats. The group established its own paramilitary force, complete with armed guards and stockpiles of weapons, to protect its interests and intimidate outsiders. One of Synanon's most notorious acts was the forced sterilization of male members. Dederick convinced his followers that procreation was a selfish act that distracted from their higher purpose. Women were also coerced into having abortions, often against their will. These actions, justified as necessary for the group's survival, revealed the extent to which Synanon had devolved into a totalitarian regime. The breaking point came in 1978, when Synanon's escalating violence captured national attention. After attorney Paul Morantz won a lawsuit against the organization on behalf of a former member, Synanon retaliated in a horrifying way. Members placed a rattlesnake, with its rattle removed, in Morantz's mailbox. He was bitten and narrowly survived the attack. This act of attempted murder, coupled with mounting evidence of Synanon's abuses, prompted a full-scale investigation by law enforcement. The once praised organization was now in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Could an institution built on the promise of healing ever redeem itself after such atrocities? By the early 1980s, Synanon was facing a slew of lawsuits and criminal charges. Dederick, whose health was deteriorating, was arrested but managed to avoid prison time by pleading no contest and agreeing to retire from leadership. Without its figurehead, Synanon's empire crumbled. The group filed for bankruptcy in 1991, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and broken lives. For the survivors, the end of Synanon was both a relief and a challenge. Many struggle to rebuild their lives after years of manipulation and abuse. The scars of their experiences served as a painful reminder of how easily hope can be weaponized. Former members have shared harrowing accounts of their time in Synanon. One survivor described the relentless pressure to conform. If you questioned anything, you were the enemy. They made you feel like leaving was a betrayal, not just of them, but of yourself. Another recounted the psychological toll of the game. It wasn't therapy, it was torment. They broke you down until you didn't know who you were anymore. And then they rebuilt you in their image. These stories offer a window into the methods of control that define Synanon, providing valuable lessons for recognizing and resisting such tactics in other contexts. The rise and fall of Synanon is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of those seeking community and purpose. It highlights the fine line between helping and harming, between leadership and domination. Most importantly, it underscores the importance of questioning authority, no matter how benevolent it may seem. Number 8. Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS. A kingdom built on control. Beneath the vast open skies of the American Southwest, a community flourished, seemingly insulated from the modern world. This was the domain of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or FLDS, a group that proclaimed itself the guardian of divine truth. Yet within its tightly controlled enclaves, life was far from idyllic. This is a story of unyielding power, manipulation, and the exploitation of faith, a story that forces us to confront the lengths to which belief can be stretched in the pursuit of control. What happens when one man holds the power to dictate the course of thousands of lives? How does faith become a weapon to subjugate rather than uplift? The FLDS emerged in the early 20th century as a breakaway faction from the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS, which had officially renounced polygamy in 1890. For the FLDS, however, the practice of plural marriage was not just a tenet of faith, but a divine mandate. They viewed themselves as the true keepers of the Mormon doctrine, untainted by societal compromise. Their communities, often located in remote areas of Utah, Arizona, and beyond, were designed to foster separation from the outside world. Members were taught that their leaders were divinely inspired and that obedience to them was equivalent to obedience to God. But what happens when this isolation breeds not just independence, but unchecked authority? What do you do when the walls meant to protect you become your prison? The FLDS was thrust into the national spotlight with the rise of Warren Jeffs, who assumed leadership in 2002 following the death of his father, Rulon Jeffs. Warren quickly consolidated his power, declaring himself the sole mouthpiece of God on earth. He wielded absolute authority, controlling every aspect of his followers' lives, from their marriages and careers to their access to information and education. Under Jeffs, polygamy intensified. He arranged marriages between older men and underage girls, claiming these unions were divinely ordained. Women had no say in whom they married, while men who fell out of favor with Jeffs were banished from the community, their families reassigned to more loyal followers. What would you do if your entire existence was dictated by one man's whim? How would you navigate a world where questioning authority meant losing everything? Life within FLDS communities was marked by strict control and relentless indoctrination. Members were required to wear modest, uniform clothing, eschew modern conveniences, and dedicate their lives to the church's teachings. Education was limited, particularly for girls, who were groomed from a young age to become obedient wives and mothers. As we dive deeper into these fascinating stories, if you're finding value in what you're watching, consider hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. This way, you'll never miss the next story as we uncover even more intriguing tales together. Let's continue. One of the most insidious aspects of Jeff's regime was his manipulation of scripture. He used religious texts to justify his actions, often twisting their meanings to suit his agenda. This created an environment where questioning his authority was equated with blasphemy, leaving followers trapped in a cycle of fear and obedience. In 2008, the FLDS's hidden world was exposed when authorities raided the Yearning for Zion Ranch in Texas, one of the group's largest compounds. The raid followed allegations of underage marriages and abuse. And what investigators found was deeply disturbing. Dozens of girls, some as young as 12, were discovered to be pregnant or already mothers, having been coerced into marriages with much older men. The compound itself was a fortress, complete with a massive temple that symbolized Jeff's dominance over its followers. The raid led to the removal of over 400 children from the ranch and prompted widespread outrage. For many, it was the first glimpse into the FLDS's secretive world and the suffering that had been hidden behind its walls. What would you feel upon discovering that such a system of oppression thrived in plain sight? And how does society reconcile its failure to protect the most vulnerable for so long? Warren Jeffs' reign came to an end in 2011 when he was convicted of sexually assaulting two underage girls he had taken as spiritual wives. Sentenced to life in prison, Jeffs continues to exert influence over his followers, many of whom believe he remains their prophet. The aftermath of his conviction revealed the extent of the damage he had inflicted. Families were torn apart, and survivors faced immense challenges as they sought to rebuild their lives outside the insular world they had known. The voices of those who escaped the FLDS paint a harrowing picture of life under Jeff's rule. One survivor described the constant surveillance and pressure to conform. Every decision, every thought was controlled. You couldn't even dream of freedom because you didn't know it existed. Another survivor, a woman forced into marriage at 14, shared the heartbreak of being separated from her children after leaving the group. They told me I was evil, that I didn't deserve to be their mother. It's a pain I carry every day. These accounts underscore the resilience of the human spirit, but they also serve as a reminder of the cost of unchecked power. The FLDS's story is far from over. While the group has splintered and its influence has waned, remnants of the community continue to operate, often in secrecy. For survivors, the journey to healing is ongoing as they grapple with the trauma of their past and the challenges of navigating a world they were taught to fear. This tale is a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute authority and the vulnerability of those who place their trust in charismatic leaders. It forces us to ask difficult questions about the balance between faith and autonomy, and the responsibility society bears to protect those at risk. As we leave behind the FLDS and the shadow of its leader, we shift our focus to a movement whose charismatic guru claimed to bring enlightenment, but whose actions stirred chaos and conflict across 2 continents. Number 9. Rajneesh Movement. A tale of power, seduction, and chaos. In the dusty deserts of Oregon during the 1980s, an extraordinary spectacle unfolded. A story that blurred the lines between spiritual enlightenment and calculated manipulation. Thousands of followers, dressed in shades of red and orange, flocked to a remote commune to live under the guidance of a man who called himself Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. To some, he was a spiritual guru offering freedom and transcendence. To others, he was a dangerous manipulator who plunged his community into chaos. How did one man inspire such devotion, yet stir so much fear and division? And what happens when the pursuit of utopia descends into a power struggle that shatters lives? The Rajneesh movement began in India during the 1960s, with Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho, as its enigmatic leader. Rajneesh was a controversial figure who rejected traditional religious practices and advocated for a lifestyle that embraced free love, meditation, and material wealth, a stark contrast to the asceticism of many spiritual traditions. Attracting followers from around the world, Rajneesh's teachings emphasized breaking free from societal norms and embracing personal liberation. His ashram in Pune became a hub for affluent Western seekers disillusioned by conventional religion, offering workshops on everything from meditation to sexuality. But what happens when the desire for personal freedom is wielded as a tool for control? Can liberation coexist with absolute obedience? In 1981, facing legal troubles in India, Rajneesh and his inner circle sought refuge in the United States. They purchased a 64,000-acre ranch in Wasco County, Oregon, and established a utopian city called Rajneeshpuram. This city, complete with homes, businesses, and even an airport, was intended to be a sanctuary for Rajneesh's followers, known as sannyasins. The movement's rapid expansion alarmed local residents, who viewed Rajneeshpuram as an invasive and unwelcome presence. Tensions between the commune and the surrounding community escalated, with lawsuits, protests, and media scrutiny fueling a climate of hostility. What happens when a dream of harmony collides with the reality of human conflict? And how far will a community go to protect its vision of utopia? Central to the Rajneesh movement's operations was Ma Anand Sheela, Rajneesh's personal secretary and trusted confidant. Charismatic and ruthless, Sheela became the de facto leader of Rajneeshpuram, managing its day-to-day affairs and orchestrating its defense against perceived threats. Under Sheela's leadership, the commune began to engage in increasingly aggressive tactics. These included attempts to influence local elections, intimidate dissenters, and expand their territory. But Sheela's most infamous act was the first bioterror attack in the United States. The deliberate poisoning of salad bars in the Dalles, Oregon, with Salmonella bacteria, sickening over 750 people. This attack was part of a larger scheme to suppress voter turnout and secure political control for the commune. Could the pursuit of a spiritual ideal ever justify such extremes? At what point does the line between defense and aggression disappear entirely? As the commune grew, so did internal divisions. Sheela's authoritarian style alienated many members, leading to defections and growing discontent within Rajneeshpuram. Rajneesh himself, though largely secluded, began to distance himself from Sheela, accusing her of corruption and betrayal. In 1985, Sheela fled the commune amid accusations of embezzlement and criminal conspiracy. Her departure marked the beginning of the end for Rajneeshpuram. Federal authorities, already investigating the movement for immigration fraud and other crimes, intensified their scrutiny. Rajneesh was arrested later that year and deported after pleading guilty to immigration violations. What does it mean for a community when its leader abandons it? How does a movement built on trust and faith recover from such a betrayal? With its leaders gone and its reputation in ruins, Rajneeshpuram disbanded. The sprawling ranch was sold, and its once bustling streets fell silent. Rajneesh returned to India, where he rebranded himself as Osho and continued to attract followers until his death in 1990. For the residents of Wasco County, the departure of the Rajneeshis brought relief but also lingering resentment. The scars of their conflict with the commune remained, serving as a reminder of how easily idealism can give way to discord. Those who lived through the Rajneesh movement offer a range of perspectives. Former sannyasins described the euphoria of finding a community where they felt free to explore their spirituality and identity. It felt like we were building something extraordinary, one former member said, a place where everyone could be themselves. But others recount the darker side of life in Rajneeshpuram. There was so much fear, said a former resident. You couldn't question Sheila or Rajneesh without risking everything. Your home, your relationships, your place in the community. For the residents of Wasco County, the memory of the Rajneeshis is one of division and mistrust. They came here and tried to take over, a local farmer recalled. They said they wanted peace, but all they brought was trouble. Today, the story of the Rajneesh movement continues to fascinate and provoke debate. Documentaries, books, and films have explored its rise and fall, offering lessons about the dangers of charismatic leadership, the complexity of group dynamics, and the fine line between utopia and dystopia. The movement's legacy forces us to reflect on the nature of power and the cost of devotion. How do we balance the desire for community with the need for individual freedom? And what safeguards can prevent history from repeating itself? Number 10. Branch Davidians, the firestorm at Waco. The quiet town of Waco, Texas, with its sprawling plains and serene countryside, became the site of one of the most explosive and controversial events in modern American history. In 1993, a religious sect known as the Branch Davidians, led by a man who claimed to be a prophet, was thrust into the global spotlight. What began as an investigation into alleged illegal activities spiraled into a 51-day siege that culminated in tragedy. How did a faith-based community come to view itself as embattled soldiers in a war against the outside world? And how did a standoff escalate to a fiery catastrophe that still raises more questions than answers? The Branch Davidians trace their roots to the Davidian movement, an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, founded in the 1930s. The group believed in an imminent apocalypse and a literal interpretation of biblical prophecy. By the mid-20th century, a faction of the Davidians, led by Benjamin Rodin, established itself as the Branch Davidians, emphasizing the importance of preparing for the second coming of Christ. Their headquarters, known as Mount Carmel, became a sanctuary for members seeking to live according to their interpretation of Scripture. Life at Mount Carmel revolved around communal living, religious study, and a shared commitment to apocalyptic readiness. But what happens when a community's belief in prophecy becomes entangled with the ambitions of a charismatic leader? How does faith transform into fanaticism? In the early 1980s, a young man named Vernon Howell arrived at Mount Carmel and quickly rose to prominence within the community. Charismatic and persuasive, Howell, who later changed his name to David Koresh, claimed to have received divine revelations and positioned himself as the group's new leader. Koresh's teachings emphasized his role as the Lamb of God, who would unlock the secrets of the Bible and lead his followers through the tribulations of the end times. Under Koresh's leadership, the Branch Davidians grew increasingly insular. He enforced strict control over his followers' lives, dictating everything from their daily routines to their marriages. Koresh claimed the exclusive right to marry and father children within the community, and he took multiple wives, including underage girls, a practice that drew the attention of law enforcement. What drives people to follow a leader who demands such extreme sacrifices? Is it faith, fear, or a combination of both? By the early 1990s, reports of child abuse, weapon stockpiling, and other illegal activities at Mount Carmel had reached federal authorities. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, began investigating the group, suspecting them of violating firearm laws. Koresh's apocalyptic rhetoric and the group's growing arsenal heightened concerns about the potential for violence. On February 28, 1993, the ATF launched a raid on Mount Carmel, intending to serve a search warrant and arrest Koresh. But the operation went disastrously wrong. A firefight erupted, leaving 4 federal agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead. The failed raid set the stage for a prolonged standoff that captured the attention of the world. What could have been done to prevent such a tragic escalation? At what point does the pursuit of justice risk inciting greater harm? Following the raid, the FBI took over the operation, initiating a tense standoff that lasted for 51 days. Negotiators attempted to convince Koresh and his followers to surrender, while armored vehicles and tactical teams surrounded the compound. The standoff became a media spectacle, with live broadcasts offering glimpses into the negotiations and the lives of those inside Mount Carmel. Koresh, steadfast in his belief that he was fulfilling a divine mission, refused to surrender. He delivered recorded messages to authorities, asserting that the Branch Davidians were being persecuted for their faith. Inside the compound, men, women, and children prepared for what they believed was a final battle. Would you hold on to your faith in the face of overwhelming force? Or would the fear of destruction compel you to let go? On April 19, 1993, after weeks of failed negotiations, the FBI initiated a final assault, deploying tear gas to force the Branch Davidians out of the compound. What happened next remains a subject of intense debate. A fire broke out inside Mount Carmel, rapidly consuming the structure. By the time the flames were extinguished, 76 Branch Davidians, including Koresh and more than 20 children, had perished. Investigators later determined that the fire was likely started by the Branch Davidians themselves, though some have questioned this conclusion. Survivors and supporters of the group argue that the FBI's tactics contributed to the tragedy, while critics of Koresh hold him responsible for leading his followers to their deaths. Could this catastrophe have been avoided? And who bears the ultimate responsibility for such a devastating loss of life? Survivors of the siege provide haunting accounts of their time inside Mount Carmel. One survivor recalled the terror of the final assault. The walls were shaking, the air was filled with gas, and all we could hear were the cries of the children. It felt like the end of the world. Another survivor described the unwavering faith of Koresh's followers. We believed we were chosen, that we were fighting a holy war. Looking back, It's hard to understand how we were so blind. These personal stories offer a glimpse into the mindset of those who lived and died at Mount Carmel, highlighting the power of belief and the consequences of its manipulation. The Waco siege remains a deeply polarizing event, symbolizing both the dangers of religious extremism and the potential for government overreach. For some, it is a cautionary tale about the risks of charismatic leadership and blind obedience. For others, it serves as a stark reminder of the need for accountability and restraint in the use of force. The tragedy at Waco left a lasting impact on American society, fueling anti-government sentiment and inspiring extremist groups. It also raised critical questions about the balance between religious freedom and public safety, a debate that continues to this day. Number 11. Heaven's Gate. The search for salvation beyond the stars. Imagine a world where salvation lies not in faith, society, or the earthly bonds of family and love, but among the stars. A world where leaving behind everything you know and trust, including your physical self, is the ultimate act of devotion. This was the reality for the members of Heaven's Gate, a cult whose fascination with extraterrestrial life and spiritual ascension led to one of the most bewildering mass suicides in modern history. How did a belief in cosmic transcendence become a pathway to death? And what compels people to abandon their earthly lives for the promise of the unknown? Heaven's Gate was founded in the 1970s by Marshall Applewhite, a former music professor, and Bonnie Nettles, a nurse and spiritual seeker. The two believed they were the two, prophesied in the Book of Revelation, sent to prepare humanity for an apocalyptic transformation. Their message combined Christian eschatology with science fiction, creating a belief system that centered on the idea of leaving Earth to ascend to a higher plane of existence. Applewhite and Nettles taught that the human body was merely a vehicle for the soul, and that salvation could only be achieved by shedding earthly attachments and joining an extraterrestrial next level. They claimed that followers would ascend aboard a spacecraft, which would transport them to a utopian realm free of suffering and corruption. What makes a belief so powerful that it overshadows the innate human desire for survival? How does the promise of the extraordinary eclipse the reality of life? In its early years, Heaven's Gate attracted a small but dedicated group of followers who were drawn to its unique blend of spiritual and cosmic philosophy. Members abandoned their families, careers, and possessions to live communally under Applewhite and Nettles' guidance. They adhered to strict rules, including celibacy, a vegan diet, and a rejection of materialism. The group's practices reflected a deep commitment to purification and detachment. Members wore identical clothing and adopted androgynous appearances, emphasizing unity and the rejection of individual identity. They believed that only through absolute devotion could they achieve the spiritual readiness required for ascension. In 1985, Nettles died of cancer, a devastating blow to the group's beliefs. Applewhite initially struggled to reconcile her death with their teachings, but he eventually reframed it as part of their divine mission. He declared that Nettles had ascended to the next level and that the group must prepare to join her. This shift in doctrine intensified the group's focus on ascension and reinforced Applewhite's role as the sole spiritual guide. He became increasingly authoritarian, dictating every aspect of the members' lives and isolating them from the outside world. What happens to a belief system when its foundation is shaken? How do followers reconcile contradictions while maintaining their faith? By the mid 1990s, Heaven's Gate had largely retreated from public view. But the story took a dramatic turn in 1997 with the arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet. Applewhite became convinced that a spacecraft was following the comet, hidden from view, and that it would transport them to the next level. This belief became the catalyst for the group's final act. In March 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, including Applewhite, gathered in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. Over several days, they methodically carried out a mass suicide, believing that their deaths would free their souls to board the spacecraft. They consumed a lethal mixture of phenobarbital and vodka, covering their bodies with purple shrouds and leaving behind messages proclaiming their joy and readiness for ascension. What drives individuals to such an irreversible decision? Is it blind faith, desperation, or a deep longing for meaning that cannot be found in the here and now? The discovery of the group's bodies shocked the world, prompting a wave of media coverage and public fascination. Former members and those who knew the group shared insights into their lives and beliefs, offering a glimpse into the mindset of people who willingly chose such a path. One former member described the allure of Heaven's Gate. They offered answers to the big questions: who we are, why we're here, what happens after we die. For those of us searching, it felt like finding the ultimate truth. Survivors of the group, however, faced immense challenges in rebuilding their lives. One individual recalled the pain of leaving the group before the mass suicide. "I lost my family, my friends, everything I knew. But I couldn't go through with it. I just couldn't believe that death was the answer." The Heaven's Gate tragedy raised profound questions about the nature of belief, the power of charismatic leadership, and the vulnerability of those seeking meaning in an uncertain world. Psychologists have studied the group's dynamics to understand how social isolation, groupthink, and a shared sense of purpose can create an environment where extreme actions become normalized. Culturally, the event remains a touchstone for discussions about cults, faith, and the search for identity in an era of rapid change. The group's use of the internet to spread their message was particularly groundbreaking, highlighting the role of technology in shaping modern movements. The story of Heaven's Gate forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about human nature. How do we balance the need for spiritual exploration with the dangers of manipulation? What can society do to support individuals who feel lost or disconnected, so they don't fall prey to dangerous ideologies? And how do we honor the memory of those who were lost while learning from their choices? As the echoes of Heaven's Gate fade, we turn our attention to another community whose search for salvation ended in destruction. This time, it's a tale of a charismatic leader and a remote jungle commune that promised paradise but delivered unimaginable horror. Number 12. People's Temple. The promise of utopia that ended in catastrophe. Deep within the jungles of Guyana, the echoes of a dream-turned-nightmare still resonate. What began as a movement of hope, equality, and justice became synonymous with one of the most devastating events in modern history. The People's Temple, under the leadership of Jim Jones, promised salvation but delivered despair. leaving behind a legacy of manipulation, betrayal, and tragedy. What compels people to follow a leader so completely, even as the cracks in their vision become impossible to ignore? And how does a utopia built on promises of equality descend into an abyss of control and devastation? The story of the People's Temple began in the 1950s in Indianapolis, Indiana, where a charismatic preacher named Jim Jones founded a church with a vision of racial integration, social justice, and communal living. At a time when segregation and inequality were entrenched in American society, Jones's message of inclusivity and solidarity resonated with many, particularly among marginalized communities. Jones styled himself as a champion of the downtrodden, often referring to the People's Temple as a rainbow family. His sermons, a blend of fiery rhetoric and promises of spiritual enlightenment, captivated his followers, who believed they were part of a movement that would change the world. But what happens when a leader's charisma masks darker intentions? How do good intentions become the foundation for control? By the 1960s, Jones had moved the People's Temple to California, where it flourished. The group established headquarters in Redwood Valley, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, attracting thousands of followers. Members were required to live communally, share their resources, and dedicate themselves entirely to the church's mission. Jones's control over his followers grew increasingly authoritarian. He demanded unquestioning loyalty and used tactics such as public humiliation, physical punishment, and staged miracles to maintain his grip on power. Members were taught to view him as a messianic figure, capable of leading them to a utopian future. Could you surrender your autonomy for the promise of a better world? At what point does faith in a leader cross the line into blind obedience? In the mid-1970s, facing mounting scrutiny from the media and government agencies, Jones relocated the People's Temple to a remote settlement in Guyana, South America. This settlement, known as Jonestown, was envisioned as a socialist paradise, a self-sustaining community free from the corruption and oppression of the outside world. At its height, Jonestown housed over 900 people, including families, children, and elderly members. But the reality of life in the settlement was far from idyllic. Followers worked long hours in grueling conditions. Food and medical supplies were scarce, and Jones's paranoia and control intensified. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, ensuring no one could leave without his permission. What would you do if the utopia you were promised turned into a prison? How far would you go to convince yourself that the dream was still worth pursuing? By 1978, reports of abuse and human rights violations in Jonestown had reached the United States, prompting Congressman Leo Ryan to visit the settlement to investigate. Ryan arrived with a delegation of journalists and concerned relatives, but what they discovered confirmed the worst fears of those who had been critical of the People's Temple. While Jones orchestrated a facade of harmony during Ryan's visit, several members secretly passed notes to the congressman, pleading for help to escape. Ryan agreed to take them with him, but as the delegation prepared to leave, armed guards ambushed them at the airstrip, killing Ryan, 3 journalists, and a defector. This act of violence marked the beginning of the end. Knowing that the walls were closing in, Jones ordered his followers to prepare for revolutionary suicide. On November 18, 1978, over 900 people died in Jonestown, drinking a cyanide-laced concoction in what Jones described as an act of defiance against oppression. Among the dead were hundreds of children. Survivors of Jonestown have provided harrowing testimonies of the final hours. One woman, who managed to escape into the jungle, described the horror of watching friends and family line up to drink the poison. "It wasn't suicide, it was murder," she said. "No one wanted to die, but they were too scared to refuse." Another survivor recalled Jones's chilling words as he urged his followers to take their lives. "He told us we were martyrs, that this was our way of standing against injustice. But all I saw was fear and despair." How does one man wield such power over hundreds of people? And how do survivors reconcile their memories with the lives they must rebuild? The Jonestown Massacre shocked the world, becoming one of the largest single losses of American civilian life in a deliberate act until 9/11. The tragedy raised urgent questions about the nature of cults, the vulnerability of those seeking belonging, and the dangers of unchecked authority. For the families of the victims, the loss was incomprehensible. Many had been unaware of the extent of Jones's control or the conditions in Jonestown. For the survivors, the road to healing was long and fraught with guilt, trauma, and the challenge of reintegrating into a society that often viewed them with suspicion. Today, Jonestown remains a powerful symbol of the perils of charismatic leadership and the capacity for faith to be weaponized. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid," derived from the mass suicide, has entered the cultural lexicon, though it often obscures the complexity and tragedy of what occurred. The story of the People's Temple forces us to confront difficult truths about human nature. Why do we seek leaders to guide us, even at the risk of losing ourselves? And how can we create systems of accountability to prevent such tragedies in the future? Number 13. The Children of God. From love to exploitation. In the turbulent 1960s, amidst the counter-cultural revolution of free love and spiritual awakening, a group emerged that promised its followers a life of divine purpose and unbounded community. It called itself the Children of God, led by a self-proclaimed prophet, David Berg. To outsiders, it appeared to be a haven for those seeking solace from societal norms. But behind the facade lay a labyrinth of exploitation, manipulation, and abuse, a tale that raises profound questions about the intersections of faith, power, and morality. What begins as a quest for love and salvation can easily morph into something far more dangerous. But how do we recognize the moment when devotion becomes blind obedience? The Children of God was founded in 1968 by David Berg, an evangelical preacher with a vision of radical evangelism. Berg believed that the mainstream Christian church had strayed from its true purpose and that his movement would bring people back to God's path. He preached a doctrine of salvation through love and intimacy, combining elements of Christianity with the ethos of the free love movement. The group initially attracted young runaways, hippies, and spiritual seekers who were disillusioned with traditional religion and societal expectations. Members were encouraged to live communally, share resources, and devote themselves entirely to spreading the group's message. At its peak, the Children of God boasted tens of thousands of followers across the globe. But what happens when love is twisted into a tool for control? How does a message of salvation become a weapon of subjugation? Under Berg's leadership, the children of God became increasingly insular and authoritarian. Members were required to cut ties with their families and the outside world, reinforcing their dependence on the group. Berg's teachings grew more extreme, emphasizing total submission to his authority and the rejection of societal norms. One of the group's most controversial practices was flirty fishing, a tactic introduced by Berg in the 1970s. Female members were instructed to use their sexuality to attract new recruits and supporters, often engaging in intimate relationships with potential converts. Berg framed this practice as an expression of God's love, but critics condemned it as exploitative and abusive. What would you do if you were asked to sacrifice your dignity for the sake of your faith? At what point does loyalty to a cause conflict with your own sense of morality? Perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the Children of God was its treatment of children. Berg's writings promoted the sexualization of children, claiming that they were capable of expressing love in all forms. This ideology led to widespread abuse within the group, with children subjected to acts of exploitation and coercion under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. Survivors of the group have described a childhood marked by fear, manipulation, and a lack of autonomy. Many were isolated from mainstream society, denied formal education, and raised to view Berg as a divine figure. For these children, the line between faith and fear was razor thin. How does a movement justify actions that harm its most vulnerable members? And how can such harm persist in the name of spirituality? By the 1980s, the Children of God faced mounting criticism and legal scrutiny, particularly in the United States and Europe. Media investigations exposed the group's abusive practices, prompting a wave of defections and lawsuits. In response, the group underwent a rebranding effort, changing its name to the Family International and publicly denouncing some of Berg's most controversial teachings. Despite these efforts, the damage had already been done. Survivors began to come forward, sharing their stories of abuse and seeking justice for the harm they endured. For many, leaving the group was only the first step in a long journey of healing and reclaiming their lives. The voices of former members provide a harrowing glimpse into life within the Children of God. One survivor, who was raised in the group, described the pervasive sense of control. You weren't allowed to think for yourself. Every decision, every action was dictated by Berg's teachings. Another survivor recounted the trauma of growing up in an environment where abuse was normalized. We were taught that what was happening was God's will. It took years to unlearn that and to understand that what we went through wasn't love. It was exploitation. These testimonies underscore the resilience of those who escaped the group and serve as a powerful reminder of the human cost of manipulation and abuse. The story of the Children of God has left an indelible mark on society, highlighting the dangers of unchecked power and the vulnerability of those seeking belonging. The group's practices sparked international debates about religious freedom, child protection, and the responsibility of governments to intervene in cases of abuse. Legally, the group has faced numerous lawsuits and investigations, though many of its leaders, including Berg, evaded accountability. For survivors, the pursuit of justice remains an ongoing struggle as they work to hold those responsible accountable and ensure that future generations are protected from similar harm. The legacy of the children of God forces us to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of belief and the dynamics of power. How can society support those who feel lost or disconnected so they don't fall prey to dangerous ideologies? What safeguards can be put in place to prevent leaders from exploiting their followers? And how do we honor the resilience of survivors while holding perpetrators accountable? Number 14. The Ant Hill Kids. A community built on control and brutality. In the serene remote landscapes of Canada, a community was quietly built by a man who claimed to be a prophet. He promised his followers salvation, protection from a corrupt world, and the creation of a utopia free from sin. But what unfolded in this isolated haven was far from divine. It became a nightmare of unimaginable suffering, led by a man whose charisma concealed a sadistic thirst for power. This is the story of the Ant Hill Kids, a cult whose name belied the horrors within. How does one man gain such complete control over others? And how do individuals endure and survive under such relentless tyranny? Roche Thériault was a charismatic figure whose journey into darkness began with a vision of religious grandeur. Born in Quebec in 1947, Thériault had a troubled childhood marked by instability and abuse. As a young adult, he became increasingly fascinated by religion, eventually forming his own sect in the late 1970s. He claimed to be a prophet chosen by God to lead a select group of followers to salvation. Thériault's initial message was one of love, spiritual awakening, and communal living. His followers, men and women, disillusioned with society and searching for purpose, were drawn to his vision of a utopian existence. They gave up their possessions, severed ties with their families, and followed him into the wilderness of Ontario, where he established a commune. But what happens when the ideal of a utopia becomes a tool for control? At what point does the search for salvation blind people to the reality of abuse? Thériault named his group the Ant Hill Kids, likening their hard work and devotion to the tireless labor of ants. Life in the commune was harsh and grueling. Members were subjected to long hours of physical labor, often with little food or rest, all under the guise of building a self-sustaining community. Thériault's word was law, and any deviation from his commands was met with swift and brutal punishment. Despite the hardships, followers remained loyal, convinced that Thériault was leading them toward divine truth. He used a combination of charm, fear, and manipulation to maintain control, frequently invoking scripture to justify his actions. Members were told that their suffering was necessary for spiritual purification, a test of their faith and commitment. How does devotion to a leader grow so strong that it eclipses one's own instincts for self-preservation? And what makes people ignore red flags when they are in search of something greater? As time passed, Thériault's behavior grew increasingly erratic and violent. He began to view himself as infallible, demanding absolute obedience and resorting to extreme measures to enforce his authority. Punishments ranged from beatings to forced mutilations, acts that he framed as spiritual disciplines. Thériault's reign of terror reached its apex when he started performing gruesome medical procedures on his followers, despite having no medical training. These acts, which he justified as healing, resulted in permanent injuries and even death. Yet his followers, broken by years of manipulation and abuse, continued to obey him. What compels people to stay in an environment so toxic and destructive? Is it fear, indoctrination, or the hope that things might one day improve? The horrors of the Ant Hill Kids commune eventually came to light in 1989, when one member escaped and alerted authorities. Police raided the commune, uncovering a scene of unimaginable brutality. Theriot was arrested, and the full extent of his crimes began to emerge. He was convicted of murder and multiple counts of assault, but for many of his followers, the damage had already been done. The psychological scars left by years of abuse and manipulation were profound, and the road to recovery was long and arduous. Survivors of the Ant Hill Kids have described the torment they endured under Theriot's control. One former member recalled the constant atmosphere of fear. You never knew what would set him off. One moment he'd be kind, and the next he'd be a monster. Another survivor spoke of the difficulty of leaving. It wasn't just the physical isolation. It was the mental trap. He made us believe that there was no life outside of the commune, that the world was evil, and only he could save us. These testimonies reveal the psychological complexities of cult dynamics and the resilience of those who managed to escape. The story of the Ant Hill Kids is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the vulnerability of those seeking belonging and purpose. It highlights the lengths to which individuals will go to maintain their beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. For survivors, rebuilding their lives meant grappling with both the trauma of their experiences and the stigma of having been part of such a notorious group. Their stories serve as a powerful testament to the human capacity for endurance and recovery. The Ant Hill Kids story forces us to confront difficult questions about human behavior and the nature of power. How do we protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation? What steps can society take to recognize and intervene in situations of abuse before they escalate? And how can survivors find justice and healing in the aftermath of such profound violations? As we step away from the shadows of the Ant Hill Kids, another story beckons. A tale of divine prophecy, mass delusion, and tragic consequences. 15. Superior universal alignment. Brazil's dark descent into cult violence. Beneath the tropical landscapes and vibrant cities of Brazil, a darkness once emerged that left an indelible mark on the country's history. It was a belief system born from prophecy, driven by fear, and executed with brutal precision. The superior universal alignment, led by a self-proclaimed prophet, turned a community's faith into a weapon, unleashing terror upon the most innocent among them, young boys. How does faith, meant to unite and uplift, become a tool for destruction? And how do ordinary people become complicit in acts that defy humanity? The Superior Universal Alignment, SUE, was founded in the 1980s by Valentina de Andrade, a woman whose charisma and conviction masked a deeply disturbing ideology. De Andrade claimed to have received divine messages foretelling the end of the world. She preached that salvation could only be achieved by following her teachings, which included rejecting traditional religion, government systems, and societal norms. De Andrade's most controversial belief was that male children born after 1981 were inherently evil, vessels of corruption that needed to be eradicated to purify humanity. This warped ideology would soon become the foundation for unimaginable violence. How does a leader convince others to accept such a radical and horrifying belief? What drives people to abandon their moral compass in the name of faith? Despite the extremity of her message, De Andrade attracted a devoted group of followers. Many were professionals, teachers, doctors, and business people, seeking spiritual guidance in a turbulent world. The group operated under a veneer of secrecy, meeting in private and isolating themselves from outsiders. De Andrade reinforced her authority through a combination of fear and persuasion. Followers were told that questioning her teachings would condemn their souls and jeopardize their chances of survival in the apocalypse. Over time, her grip on the group grew unshakable, creating an environment where dissent was unthinkable. What does it take for people to surrender their judgments so completely? Is it desperation, manipulation, or a combination of both? By the late 1980s, the SUA's teachings had escalated into violence. Under De Andrade's direction, members began targeting young boys, abducting them from rural communities in northern Brazil. These children were subjected to unimaginable horrors, including ritualistic mutilation and murder, as part of the cult's efforts to purify humanity. The group's activities went largely unnoticed at first, hidden by the remoteness of the region and the silence of its members. But as more children disappeared, fear and suspicion began to grip the local communities. Parents lived in constant dread, and the authorities struggled to piece together the evidence needed to stop the violence. What would you do if your child's life was threatened by an invisible force? How does a community respond when the danger comes from within? In the early 1990s, a breakthrough came when survivors of the group's attacks began to speak out. Their testimonies revealed a harrowing pattern of abuse and murder, implicating De Andrade and her followers in a campaign of terror that had claimed the lives of several boys. Authorities raided the group's compound, uncovering evidence of their crimes, including written documents detailing their beliefs and plans. The revelations shocked the nation and brought international attention to the case, highlighting the extent of the group's atrocities. How does the community heal after such devastating revelations? And what justice can be achieved for crimes that defy comprehension? De Andrade and several high-ranking members of the SUA were arrested and put on trial in the mid-1990s. The proceedings revealed the full extent of the group's crimes, including the systematic targeting of children and the psychological manipulation of its followers. Witnesses described De Andrade's commanding presence and her ability to instill both fear and loyalty in those around her. While De Andrade maintained her innocence and claimed she had no knowledge of the murders, the evidence against her was overwhelming. Several members were convicted and sentenced to prison, though De Andrade herself managed to avoid significant punishment due to a lack of direct evidence tying her to the crimes. The testimonies of survivors and investigators provide a haunting glimpse into the SUA's inner workings. One mother, whose son was among the victims, described the anguish of living in fear. "We couldn't let our children play outside. Every time they left the house, we worried it might be the last time we saw them." A former follower of De Andrade recounted the psychological grip she held over her members. "She made us believe that we were chosen, that we were saving the world. It wasn't until it was too late that I realized the cost." These accounts serve as a reminder of the resilience of those who survive such horrors and the importance of confronting the ideologies that enable them. The story of the SUA remains a dark chapter in Brazil's history, one that underscores the dangers of charismatic leadership and the vulnerabilities of those searching for meaning. For the families of the victims, the pain of their loss is compounded by the knowledge that De Andrade avoided true accountability for her role in the crimes. The case also raised broader questions about the role of societal institutions in preventing such tragedies. How can communities identify and address the warning signs of extremist behavior? And what steps can be taken to protect the most vulnerable from harm? The saga of the superior universal alignment forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human capacity for both belief and cruelty. It challenges us to consider how we balance the need for spiritual exploration with the responsibility to protect one another from harm. Most importantly, it serves as a stark warning of what can happen when ideology is allowed to overshadow humanity. Number 16. Angel's Landing, a community cloaked in secrets and tragedy. Nestled on a 20-acre compound outside Wichita, Kansas, there existed a community that seemed, on the surface, idyllic, but beneath its tranquil facade lay a labyrinth of deceit, control, and betrayal, orchestrated by a man who claimed to have divine powers. Angel's Landing, as it was called, became the epicenter of a chilling web of manipulation, with its enigmatic leader at the helm. How does one man's charisma eclipse the moral compasses of those who follow him? And what happens when a promise of salvation turns into a nightmare of exploitation? At the heart of Angel's Landing was Lou Castro, a man who portrayed himself as a seer with supernatural abilities. Castro convinced his followers that he could predict the future and foresee death, granting him an almost godlike status. His persona was one of mystique and allure, and he wielded it masterfully to attract a tight-knit group of followers who believed they were part of something extraordinary. Castro's charisma was intoxicating. He lived lavishly, driving expensive cars, wearing designer clothes, and hosting extravagant parties on the compound. His followers, many of whom were ordinary people seeking meaning or escape, were drawn to his promises of divine insight and security. But what is the cost of believing in someone who claims to hold the keys to the unknown? How do people justify the increasingly bizarre and dangerous demands of such a figure? Life at Angel's Landing revolved around Castro's every word. Followers adhered to his teachings and deferred to his decisions in all matters, from finances to personal relationships. Castro's influence extended into every aspect of their lives, creating an insular environment where questioning his authority was unthinkable. Members were encouraged to pool their resources, with Castro maintaining control over the group's finances. This dynamic allowed him to fund his opulent lifestyle while fostering dependence among his followers. To outsiders, Angel's Landing appeared to be a close-knit community, but within its gates, fear and control loomed large. What would compel someone to surrender their autonomy to a leader like Castro? Is it faith, desperation, or the allure of belonging to something greater than oneself? The veneer of harmony at Angel's Landing began to crack with a series of deaths that seemed at first like tragic accidents. In 2003, Patricia Hughes, a member of the community, died in what was described as a freak accident. Just 3 years later, her husband also died under mysterious circumstances. These incidents raised eyebrows, but were dismissed as unfortunate coincidences. Detective Ron Goodwin, however, was not convinced. He began to investigate Castro and the community, uncovering a disturbing pattern. Expensive life insurance policies had been taken out on members of Angel's Landing, with Castro and his followers as the beneficiaries. This revelation cast a dark shadow over the compound and raised a critical question. Were these deaths truly accidents, or was something far more sinister at play? What lengths would someone go to secure wealth and power? And how do you uncover the truth when loyalty and fear silence those who might speak out? Goodwin's investigation eventually revealed that Lou Castro was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Daniel Perez, and he had a criminal history that included fraud and sexual assault. The facade of the benevolent seer began to crumble as authorities uncovered evidence of manipulation, financial exploitation, and abuse within the community. In 2015, Castro was convicted on multiple charges, including murder, fraud, and sexual exploitation of a child. He was sentenced to life in prison, bringing an end to his reign at Angel's Landing. For his followers, the revelations were devastating, forcing them to confront the reality of the man they had trusted implicitly. How does a community rebuild after such profound betrayal? And what becomes of the survivors who must now reconcile their faith with truth? The survivors of Angel's Landing offer haunting insights into the group's inner workings. One former member described the suffocating control Castro wielded. He made you believe he could see everything, even your thoughts. You couldn't hide anything from him. And that's what kept us in line. Another survivor recounted the moment they realized the truth. When I found out who he really was, it felt like my entire world collapsed. Everything I had believed, everything I had sacrificed, it was all based on a lie. These testimonies underscore the psychological toll of living under Castro's influence and the resilience of those who eventually broke free. The story of Angel's Landing serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked charisma and the vulnerability of those searching for meaning. It highlights the insidious ways in which power can be wielded to exploit trust, sow fear, and silence dissent. For the survivors, the road to healing is long and complex. Many struggle with feelings of guilt, shame, and loss as they work to rebuild their lives and reclaim their identities. Their courage in sharing their stories provides a powerful testament to the human capacity for resilience and recovery. The tale of Angel's Landing forces us to ask critical questions about the nature of power, trust, and belief. How do we protect ourselves and our communities from individuals who exploit faith and loyalty for their own gain? What can we learn from these stories to prevent similar tragedies in the future? And how do we support those who have been victimized as they work to rebuild their lives? Number 17. Los Narcosatánicos, the cult that blended crime, power, and ritual amid the vibrant streets of Mexico in the late 1980s. A shadowy group emerged, a cult that seamlessly intertwined the world of narcotics trafficking with occult rituals. Led by a man whose sinister charisma commanded loyalty and fear in equal measure, Los Narcosatánicos operated in the dark spaces where belief and brutality converged. Their story is one of power, superstition, and violence that left an entire region reeling. How does fear of the supernatural become a tool to consolidate control? And what happens when faith in the unexplainable meets the ruthlessness of organized crime. At the center of this dark web was Adolfo Constanzo, a man whose path was marked by an insatiable hunger for power. Born in Miami in 1962, Constanzo was introduced to the practices of Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Caribbean religion that combines elements of magic and spiritualism. His mother, a devout practitioner, instilled in him the belief that these rituals could offer protection and success in life. As Constanzo grew, so did his obsession with the occult. He trained as a padrino, or high priest of Palo Mayombe, gaining a reputation for his mastery of rituals and his ability to manipulate those around him. By the early 1980s, he had moved to Mexico City, where his blend of charisma and fearlessness allowed him to attract a devoted following. What drives someone to believe they can wield supernatural powers? And how do followers come to see such a figure as both savior and ruler? Constanzo's cult began with a small group of loyal adherents, but it quickly expanded as he offered his services to some of Mexico's most powerful drug cartels. He convinced them that his rituals could protect their shipments, make them invisible to law enforcement, and guarantee their dominance in the drug trade. Members of Los Narcosatanicos included men and women from all walks of life, criminals, traffickers, and even well-connected elites, who believed that Constanzo's powers were the key to their success. The group operated out of a ranch near Matamoros, a sprawling property that became both a sanctuary and a site of unspeakable horrors. What compels powerful individuals to place their trust in rituals over reason? And how do belief and desperation combine to create such loyalty? Constanzo's ceremonies were not merely symbolic. They were acts of terror designed to instill obedience and fear. Animals were sacrificed as offerings to the spirits, their remains used in elaborate rituals meant to invoke protection and power. Over time, however, Constanzo's thirst for control escalated, and he began incorporating human sacrifices into his practices. Victims were often chosen from the most vulnerable: homeless individuals, prostitutes, and rival cartel members. The brutal killings were meant to strengthen the group's resolve and demonstrate Constanzo's dominance. By 1989, at least 15 bodies had been discovered on the cult's property, though the true number of victims remains unknown. How does a community react when confronted with evidence of such atrocities? And what happens to a group when fear becomes its driving force? The beginning of the end for Los Narcosatanicos came with the disappearance of Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old University of Texas student who had traveled to Matamoros for spring break. Kilroy was abducted by members of the cult and taken to the ranch, where he was brutally murdered as part of a ritual. Kilroy's disappearance sparked an international search effort, drawing attention to the cult's activities. Under pressure, authorities raided the ranch and uncovered evidence of the group's gruesome rituals, including an altar adorned with human remains. The discovery shocked the world and revealed the extent of Constanzo's influence. Realizing that the walls were closing in, Constanzo and several of his followers fled to Mexico City. In May 1989, police tracked them to an apartment, leading to a tense standoff. Rather than face capture, Constanzo ordered one of his followers to shoot him and his closest confidant, Sara Aldrete. The deaths of Constanzo and Aldrete marked the collapse of Los Narcosatanicos, but the scars left by their reign of terror remained. Survivors and victims' families struggled to come to terms with the horrors they had endured, while the region grappled with the cultural and psychological impact of the cult's activities. Those who encountered Los Narcosatánicos describe a climate of fear and submission. A former member recalled the power Constanzo held over his followers. He made us believe he could see everything, that he controlled life and death. We feared him more than anything. For the families of victims like Mark Kilroy, the pain was unimaginable. We never thought something like this could happen, his parents said. He was just a young man enjoying his life. How could it end in such a horrible way? These stories serve as a reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and belief. The story of Los Narcosatánicos remains a dark chapter in Mexico's history, one that underscores the dangers of combining superstition with criminal enterprise. For many, it is a cautionary tale about the power of fear and the vulnerability of those searching for answers in a chaotic world. The case also highlighted the need for vigilance in combating cult-like organizations and protecting those who may be drawn into their orbit. For survivors, the journey to healing continues as they work to rebuild their lives and reclaim their sense of security. Los Narcosatánicos force us to confront difficult questions about belief and morality. How do we prevent the exploitation of faith for personal gain? What can we do to recognize and address the warning signs of dangerous ideologies? And how do we ensure that those affected by such atrocities receive the justice and support they deserve? Number 18. The Kirtland Cult, a prophet's grip on faith and fear. In the heart of Ohio's quiet countryside, during the late 1980s, a small community became the stage for a tale of unchecked power and devastating betrayal. This was the Kirtland Cult, led by a man who claimed divine authority to interpret God's will. Under his command, faith and devotion became tools of control, with devastating consequences for those who dared to question him. What compels individuals to surrender their autonomy to someone who claims to speak for God? And how does a shared belief in a divine mission transform into a tragedy that shakes an entire community? Jeffrey Lundgren began his journey within the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, RLDS, an offshoot of Mormonism. A self-proclaimed prophet, Lundgren quickly gained a reputation for his captivating sermons and deep understanding of Scripture. He presented himself as a devout family man, but beneath this exterior was a growing hunger for control. In 1987, Lundgren was dismissed from the RLDS for embezzling funds. But this only strengthened his resolve to forge his own path. He declared that the mainstream RLDS had strayed from its divine mission and that God had chosen him to lead the faithful. His followers, a group of disillusioned believers seeking spiritual guidance, gravitated toward his charisma and certainty. But how does a leader convince others that he holds the exclusive truth? And what happens when that truth becomes a weapon for manipulation? Lundgren established a commune in a rented farmhouse near Kirtland, Ohio, where his followers lived under strict rules and isolation from the outside world. Life in the commune revolved around scripture study, group activities, and complete obedience to Lundgren's teachings. He preached that the second coming of Christ was imminent and that only those who followed him would be saved. To maintain control, Lundgren fostered an environment of fear and loyalty. He claimed to receive direct revelations from God, which often included instructions on how his followers should live their lives. Disobedience was equated with spiritual damnation, leaving members too afraid to question his authority. Can fear alone sustain such devotion, or is there a deeper psychological need that binds followers to a leader like Lundgren? Among Lundgren's followers was the Avery family, a couple, Dennis and Cheryl, and their 3 children, who had sold their home and given their savings to the group. Despite their contributions, Lundgren grew increasingly critical of the Averys, accusing them of being insincere in their faith and disobedient to God's will. In April 1989, Lundgren declared that the Averys' failure to fully integrate into the commune endangered the entire group's salvation. He claimed that God had instructed him to carry out a blood sacrifice to atone for their sins and secure the community's future. Under the guise of a spiritual ritual, Lundgren lured the family into a barn on the property. That night, in a shocking act of brutality, Lundgren and his followers murdered the Avery family, one by one. The bodies were buried in a pit on the property, their fates hidden from the outside world. How does a community recover when its trust is weaponized in such a heinous way? And what allows a leader to justify the taking of innocent lives? The truth about the Kirtland cult began to unravel when disillusioned members came forward, revealing details of the murder and Lundgren's growing paranoia. Local authorities, initially skeptical of such a horrific claim, launched an investigation that led them to the farmhouse. The discovery of the Averys' bodies in January 1990 shocked the nation. Lundgren and several of his followers were arrested and charged with murder, conspiracy, and other crimes. During his trial, Lundgren remained unrepentant, insisting that his actions were divinely ordained and that he had merely followed God's instructions. How does a justice system address crimes committed in the name of faith? And can accountability ever truly heal the wounds left by such acts? Survivors and former followers of the Kirtland cult have shared haunting accounts of life under Lundgren's rule. One member described the psychological grip he maintained. He made us believe that questioning him was the same as questioning God. We were trapped, not by walls, but by fear. Another recalled the pain of realizing the extent of Lundgren's betrayal. I joined because I believed in God's love and salvation. I never thought it would lead to something so horrific. These testimonies highlight the complexities of faith and the devastating consequences of placing trust in the wrong hands. Jeffrey Lundgren was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was executed in 2006, but for the survivors and the families of the victims, the scars remain. The Kirtland cult serves as a stark reminder of the potential for religious fervor to be manipulated by those seeking power and control. For the community of Kirtland, the tragedy forced a reckoning with the dangers of insular belief systems and the importance of vigilance in identifying and addressing harmful dynamics. The legacy of the cult continues to provoke difficult questions about the balance between faith and accountability. The Kirtland cult story challenges us to examine the role of leaders in shaping belief and behavior. How do we safeguard against the exploitation of faith? What systems can we put in place to protect individuals and communities from falling prey to dangerous ideologies? And how do we honor the memory of those lost while ensuring that history does not repeat itself? Number 19. Villa Baviera, the secret world of Colonia, Dignidad hidden within the lush landscapes of southern Chile. A seemingly peaceful commune operated for decades under a veil of secrecy. Known as Colonia Dignidad, later renamed Villa Baviera. It was founded by a man who claimed to offer refuge and spiritual guidance. But behind the serene facade of this isolated settlement lay a regime of control, abuse, and complicity in crimes that reverberated far beyond its gates. How does a community built on trust become a fortress of fear? And how do the shadows of one man's past cast darkness over the lives of so many? Paul Schaeffer, a former Nazi medic and lay preacher, fled Germany in 1961 amid allegations of child abuse. Arriving in Chile, he reinvented himself as a spiritual leader and established Colonia Dignidad with a group of loyal followers. Schaeffer promised them a utopia, a community rooted in faith, discipline, and hard work. From the beginning, Schaeffer maintained an iron grip on the colony. Members lived under strict rules, with their daily lives dictated by Schaeffer's whims. Families were separated, with children raised communally, and adults forbidden from forming romantic relationships. Schaeffer claimed this was necessary to maintain purity and devotion, but it was a means to consolidate his authority. How does one man convince hundreds to surrender their autonomy? And what happens when the desire for belonging blinds people to the warning signs of tyranny? For those within Colonia Dignidad, life was a paradox. Outwardly, the settlement appeared self-sufficient and industrious, with farms, schools, and medical facilities. Residents were told they were part of a divine mission, isolated from the corruption of the outside world. But beneath this facade, Schaeffer orchestrated a regime of fear and abuse. Punishments for perceived disobedience were severe, ranging from public humiliation to physical violence. Schaeffer manipulated his followers through propaganda, fostering an environment where questioning his authority was unthinkable. Children were particularly vulnerable. Schaeffer subjected many to sexual abuse, claiming it was part of their spiritual education. His ability to exploit their trust and isolate them from protective adults ensured his crimes went unchallenged for decades. How does a community reconcile with the realization that the protector they trusted was their greatest threat? And what responsibility do bystanders bear when silence enables such horrors? Colonia Dignidad's secrets extended far beyond its borders. During Chile's military dictatorship under General Augusto Pinochet, the settlement became a hub for state-sponsored atrocities. The colony's remote location and Schaeffer's authoritarian control made it an ideal site for imprisoning and torturing political dissidents. Schaeffer and his followers collaborated with Pinochet's regime, providing logistical support and participating in the abuse of prisoners. Survivors have recounted the terror of being held within the colony, subjected to inhumane treatment, while Schaeffer and his associates acted with impunity. What compels a community to align itself with oppression? And how does fear warp the moral compass of individuals who might otherwise act with compassion? By the 1990s, international attention began to focus on Colonia Dignidad. Survivors of Schaeffer's abuse and former residents who had escaped the settlement began speaking out, revealing the extent of the horrors within. Investigations uncovered evidence of widespread human rights abuses, as well as Schaeffer's financial crimes and his collaboration with the Pinochet regime. In 1997, Schaefer fled Chile to avoid prosecution. He was eventually captured in Argentina in 2005 and extradited back to Chile, where he was convicted of sexual abuse and other crimes. Schaefer died in prison in 2010, leaving behind a legacy of pain and unanswered questions for his victims. Survivors of Colonia Dignidad have described the psychological and physical toll of life under Schaefer's rule. One former resident recalled the constant surveillance. There was nowhere to hide, no moment of privacy. Schaefer knew everything, and the fear of his punishment kept us silent. A political dissident who survived torture at the colony recounted the brutality. It wasn't just a prison. It was a place where humanity was stripped away. The people there were complicit, and Schaefer made sure no one could escape. These accounts serve as a testament to the resilience of those who endured the colony's abuses, and as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. After Schaefer's fall, Colonia Dignidad was renamed Villa Baviera in an effort to distance the community from its dark past. Some residents chose to remain, working to rebuild the settlement as a legitimate agricultural and tourism enterprise. But for many, the scars of their experiences remain, and the colony's history continues to cast a long shadow. The story of Villa Baviera raises profound questions about accountability and forgiveness. How does a community move forward after decades of complicity in abuse? And what responsibility does society have to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated? Villa Baviera's story challenges us to confront the complexities of human behavior in the face of authoritarianism. How do individuals navigate the tension between personal morality and collective loyalty? What mechanisms can be put in place to prevent communities from becoming havens for abuse? And how do survivors find justice and healing in the aftermath of such profound violations? Number 20. The Raelians, a faith forged in the stars. In the realm of the extraordinary, where science fiction and spirituality converge, a movement emerged that redefined the boundaries of belief. The Raelians, founded by a French journalist and race car driver named Claude Vorillon, built their faith on a premise as audacious as it was controversial: that humanity's origins lay not in divine creation, but in extraterrestrial intervention. What followed was a story of devotion, scandal, and ambition that continues to intrigue and bewilder. What draws people to a belief system so far removed from conventional faith? And how does the promise of cosmic connection become a foundation for controversy and division? In December 1973, Claude Vorillon claimed to have an encounter that would alter the course of his life and the lives of thousands who would later follow him. While visiting a volcanic crater in central France, Vorillon alleged that he was approached by an extraterrestrial being called Yahweh, who arrived in a spacecraft. According to Vorillon, Yahweh revealed that life on Earth had been scientifically engineered by an advanced alien race called the Elohim. These beings, Vorillon was told, had visited humanity throughout history, inspiring the world's religions and serving as humanity's true creators. Yahweh bestowed upon him the mission to spread this revelation and prepare Earth for the Elohim's return. Vorillon adopted the name Rael, declaring himself the chosen messenger of the Elohim. With a blend of charisma and conviction, he began attracting followers who shared his vision of a scientifically driven, extraterrestrial-inspired faith. But how does one differentiate between divine revelation and human fabrication? And what makes such a message resonate across cultures and continents? Rallian teachings emphasize science, free will, and the rejection of traditional religious dogma. Central to their beliefs is the idea that humanity must prepare to welcome the Elohim by building an embassy to receive them. Rail has claimed that this embassy must include a helipad for their spacecraft and be situated in a neutral, peaceful location. The Raelian philosophy also promotes sexual freedom, gender equality, and the pursuit of scientific advancement. These progressive values, combined with the allure of a connection to extraterrestrial creators, have attracted a diverse following from around the world. However, critics have accused the movement of being a cult, pointing to its hierarchical structure, Rael's absolute authority, and controversies surrounding its practices. Yet, the Raelians continue to defend their beliefs as a rational alternative to traditional faiths. What happens when the boundaries between spirituality and science are blurred? And how does a community navigate the line between innovation and controversy? The Raelians gained global attention and sparked outrage in 2002 when they announced that their scientific branch, Clonade, had successfully cloned a human being. A woman named Brigitte Boisselier, a high-ranking member of the movement, claimed that a baby girl named Eve was born through cloning under their supervision. The announcement sent shockwaves through the scientific and religious communities, igniting debates about the ethics and feasibility of human cloning. Critics questioned the lack of evidence for Clonade's claims, accusing the Raelians of fabricating the story for publicity. Despite the controversy, the Raelians capitalized on the media frenzy, using it to promote their message of scientific progress and human potential. What motivates a movement to make such extraordinary claims? Is it a quest for legitimacy or a strategy to challenge societal norms? For those who join the Raelians, the appeal lies not only in their teachings, but in the sense of community and purpose they provide. Members participate in rituals such as sensual meditation and celebrate annual events like Rael's encounter with the Elohim. The movement also emphasizes the importance of personal transformation and self-empowerment. However, former members and critics have raised concerns about the group's internal dynamics. Allegations of financial exploitation, coercion, and manipulation have surfaced, painting a more complex picture of life within the movement. What keeps members devoted to a belief system often criticized from the outside? And how does a community balance its ideals with the realities of human behavior? The Raelians' influence extends beyond their immediate community. They have been vocal advocates for issues such as women's rights, LGBTQ+ acceptance, and scientific freedom, often positioning themselves as disruptors of traditional societal norms. Their actions have sparked both admiration and condemnation, challenging perceptions of what a modern spiritual movement can be. For many, the Raelians represent a curious blend of optimism and audacity, a group that dares to reimagine humanity's place in the cosmos while confronting the skepticism and ridicule of a world grounded in convention. Current and former members of the Raelians offer diverse perspectives on their experiences. One devoted follower described the movement as a family that believes in something bigger than ourselves, a chance to unite with our creators. Another, who later left the group, recounted the difficulty of questioning royal's authority. It wasn't just about the beliefs, it was about the control he had over every aspect of our lives. These testimonies reveal the duality of the movement, a source of inspiration for some and a source of disillusionment for others. The Raelian movement continues to evolve, with members in over 90 countries and an enduring mission to build their embassy for the Elohim. Whether viewed as a genuine faith, a social experiment, or a provocative challenge to traditional beliefs, the Raelians have undeniably carved out a unique place in the landscape of modern spirituality. Their story raises profound questions about the nature of belief, the intersection of science and faith, and the lengths to which humanity will go in its quest for connection and meaning. The Raelian's tale invites us to consider the power of imagination in shaping our understanding of existence. How do we navigate the tension between skepticism and open-mindedness? What responsibilities do leaders have when guiding others into uncharted realms of belief? And how can we foster dialogue and understanding in a world divided by differing visions of truth? From the cosmos to the criminal underworld, we now descend into a world where faith and violence intertwined in unimaginable ways. In Mexico, a cult leader's obsession with power turned belief into a deadly game. Number 21. The Church of the Lamb of God. A bloody trail of faith and betrayal. In the quiet desert landscapes of Mexico, a church arose with a leader who proclaimed himself the direct voice of God. What began as a schism within an existing religious group morphed into a saga of bloodshed, manipulation, and unrelenting control. This is the story of the Church of the Lamb of God, a community led by Ervil LeBaron, a man who used faith as a weapon and loyalty as a shield. How does devotion turn into destruction? And how do religious teachings evolve into orders that justify taking lives? Ervil LeBaron's journey into infamy began with a dispute over doctrine. Born into a family of fundamentalist Mormons, LeBaron grew up in a community that upheld practices like polygamy long after mainstream Mormonism had renounced them. When disagreements arose about leadership succession within the sect, Ervil broke away, forming his own faction, the Church of the Lamb of God. LeBaron declared himself a prophet, insisting he had received divine revelations. His teachings centered on a concept called blood atonement, a controversial and long-abandoned idea in Mormon theology that justified killing sinners to save their souls. Under this guise, LeBaron demanded absolute loyalty and began targeting anyone he deemed a threat to his authority, including family members and former allies. What happens when religious fervor is twisted into justification for violence? And how does belief in a leader's divine authority silence moral doubts? LeBaron's leadership was marked by terror and paranoia. He issued death warrants for dissenters, instructing his followers to carry out assassinations in the name of God. His victims included his brother Joel, the leader of the rival faction, and Rulon Allred, the head of a different fundamentalist group. These killings solidified LeBaron's control while sending a clear message to those who might oppose him. Within the Church of the Lamb of God, loyalty was enforced with brutal precision. Followers lived in fear of LeBaron's wrath, knowing that disobedience could mean exile, or worse. Families were torn apart as members were coerced into participating in acts of violence, often against their own kin. How does fear reshape a person's sense of right and wrong? And what responsibility do individuals bear when they are complicit in a leader's destructive commands. LeBaron's use of religious ideology to justify murder earned him the moniker the Mormon Manson. Like Charles Manson, LeBaron exploited his followers' devotion to carry out his deadly agenda. Over time, the Church of the Lamb of God became less a place of worship and more a network of operatives, carrying out assassinations and other crimes at LeBaron's behest. By the late 1970s, LeBaron's list of enemies had grown long, and his paranoia reached new heights. He published a manifesto known as the Book of the New Covenants, which outlined his justification for the killings and named dozens of individuals he considered threats to the Church. This document became a death list for his followers to act upon, further entrenching the Church's identity as a community of violence. What happens to a faith community when its doctrine revolves around destruction? And how do followers reconcile the teachings of love and redemption with acts of terror? LeBaron's reign came to an end in 1981 when he was arrested and convicted of orchestrating Rulon Allred's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, but even behind bars, his influence persisted. LeBaron continued to issue orders to his followers, demonstrating the depth of their devotion and the reach of his control. In 1981, LeBaron died of a heart attack in his cell, but the Church of the Lamb of God did not dissolve with him. His teachings and death lists continued to guide his followers, leading to further acts of violence in the years after his death. The ripple effects of his leadership extended far beyond his lifetime, leaving a legacy of fear and destruction. Those who escaped the Church of the Lamb of God have shared harrowing stories of their experiences. One former follower described the pervasive sense of dread. "You lived every day knowing you could be next on his list. It wasn't faith, it was survival." Another account came from a woman whose family was divided by LeBaron's commands. "He turned us against each other, using God as his weapon. I lost my brother to his orders, and I'll never forgive myself for not stopping it." These testimonies reveal the human cost of LeBaron's leadership and the enduring scars left on those who survived his rule. The story of Ervil LeBaron and his church serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the manipulation of religious belief. It highlights the vulnerabilities of individuals seeking spiritual guidance and the devastating consequences of placing blind trust in a leader. For those impacted by the Church of the Lamb of God, the journey to healing continues. The community's history remains a source of pain and reflection, forcing us to confront the dark side of faith when it is wielded as a tool for control and violence. Number 22. Cargo cults. Faith born from the mysteries of the modern world. Far away in the islands of the South Pacific, nestled in isolated communities untouched by the hustle of industrialized nations, a unique and profound phenomenon emerged. During World War II, the arrival of foreign soldiers and their supplies of cargo, mysterious items of immense utility and beauty, sparked an awakening that would shape belief systems for generations. These beliefs, known as cargo cults, represent a fascinating intersection of tradition, spirituality, and the bewildering influence of the modern world. What does it mean to witness the unimaginable for the first time? And how does a society integrate the inexplicable into its understanding of the universe? The story of cargo cults begins during World War II, when remote Pacific islands became crucial strategic points for Allied and Axis forces. As soldiers arrived, they brought with them supplies. Everything from canned food and radios to airplanes and vehicles that seemed otherworldly to the indigenous populations. For many islanders, these goods, referred to as cargo, appeared to be gifts from the gods or ancestral spirits. The sudden influx of technology, combined with limited interaction and explanation from the soldiers, created fertile ground for new interpretations of these events. In a world previously defined by subsistence living and traditional rituals, the cargo represented both a blessing and a profound mystery. How do people reconcile the appearance of advanced technology with a worldview shaped by centuries of tradition? And how does awe transform into reverence? As the war ended and the soldiers departed, the flow of cargo ceased, leaving behind a vacuum of understanding and a longing for the divine bounty to return. In response, several communities began to develop rituals aimed at summoning the cargo back to their shores. Wooden airstrips were built, complete with control towers and imitation airplanes crafted from bamboo. Islanders would march in formation, mimicking the drills of soldiers they had observed, and light fires to guide the cargo ships home. These acts were not mere mimicry, but deeply spiritual practices, rooted in a belief that such devotion would please the gods or ancestors and bring the blessings of cargo once again. What do these rituals tell us about the human need to make sense of the unknown? And how do acts of faith evolve when faced with profound change? One of the most well-known cargo cults centers on the figure of John Frum, a messianic figure believed to have promised the return of cargo and prosperity to his followers. Stories of John Frum vary, with some describing him as an American serviceman and others as a divine being. His name, thought to derive from the phrase John from America, became a symbol of hope and renewal. To this day, the John Frum movement persists in places like Tanna Island in Vanuatu, where villagers celebrate February 15th as John Frum Day. Devotees hold parades, raise American flags, and perform rituals in anticipation of his prophesied return. What compels a community to maintain faith in a figure whose origins are shrouded in ambiguity? And how does such faith adapt to the pressures of modernization and skepticism? The phenomenon of cargo cults has often been misunderstood or dismissed by outsiders as naive or primitive. Anthropologists, historians, and religious scholars have debated the nature of these movements, with some viewing them as legitimate spiritual expressions and others as responses to cultural upheaval. In modern times, some cargo cults have adapted to changing circumstances, incorporating elements of Christianity, global politics, and contemporary technology into their practices. For others, the rituals remain a poignant reminder of a time when their worlds collided with the forces of modernity. How do communities preserve their cultural identity while navigating a globalized world? And what lessons can we learn from their resilience and adaptability? Visitors to the islands have described the profound sense of devotion and hope within these communities. One traveler recounted witnessing a ceremony on Tanna Island. It wasn't about the cargo. It was about the belief. Their faith wasn't in the goods, but in the promise of something greater. A researcher who studied the John Frum movement noted its deeper significance. This isn't just about airplanes or radios. It's about a connection to ancestors, a longing for prosperity, and a way of making sense of a world that's constantly changing. These accounts challenge us to see cargo cults not as relics of the past, but as vibrant, evolving expressions of human spirituality. Cargo cults continue to captivate the imagination of scholars and the public alike, serving as a testament to humanity's ability to find meaning in the face of the unknown. They remind us that belief systems are not static but dynamic, shaped by encounters with the unfamiliar and the desire to bridge the gap between the material and the spiritual. For the islanders who maintained these traditions, the rituals are not just about the past, they are about the future, a way of preserving their culture and asserting their identity in a world that often seeks to homogenize and assimilate. The story of cargo cults forces us to reflect on the universal human quest for understanding and connection. How do we interpret phenomena that defy explanation? What role do rituals play in helping us navigate the complexities of life? And how do we honor the diverse ways in which cultures respond to the forces of change? Number 23. Imagine a modern self-help movement that promised empowerment, personal growth, and a roadmap to achieving your life's fullest potential. This was the allure of NXIVM, founded in 1998 by Keith Raniere, a charismatic figure who presented himself as a visionary teacher. At first glance, NXIVM appeared as an innocuous organization offering workshops and classes designed to unlock human potential. With its polished facade, NXIVM attracted over 18,000 followers, including celebrities, successful professionals, and people searching for purpose in a fast-paced world. But beneath this carefully curated image lay a network of manipulation, control, and abuse. At the heart of NXIVM was a secretive subgroup known as DOS, short for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which roughly translates to Master over Slave Women. Women were recruited into DOS under the guise of a sisterhood that would uplift and empower them. What they entered, however, was a system designed to strip them of their autonomy. At the top of this pyramid scheme was Raniere, revered by followers as Vanguard. His inner circle enforced a structure that kept women in fear and subjugation. Recruits, referred to as slaves, were coerced into providing collateral, incriminating information or explicit images, under the threat of public exposure if they broke their vows of secrecy. The shocking practices within DOS included branding women with Raniere's initials using a cauterizing pen, an agonizing process often justified as a symbol of loyalty and growth. Members endured strict dietary restrictions, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation, all to maintain control. The fall of NXIVM began when former members came forward in 2017, sparking investigations that exposed its abusive practices. Raniere and several of his key associates were arrested, leading to a high-profile trial that revealed the extent of their exploitation. In 2020, Raniere was sentenced to 120 years in prison, a judgment that brought closure to many of his victims. As we leave the harrowing world of NXIVM, let us shift our gaze to a group whose leader claimed divinity in human form, commanding devotion through celestial promises. Number 24. Love Has Won. Picture a group centered around a leader who proclaimed herself as the physical manifestation of divinity, a being reincarnated over 500 times, destined to guide humanity into a golden age. This was the foundation of Love Has Won, led by Amy Carlson, who called herself Mother God. Emerging in the 2010s, this cult's reach extended globally, leveraging the power of the internet to spread its teachings and attract followers from all walks of life. Amy Carlson was not an ordinary cult leader. She crafted an identity filled with cosmic grandeur, claiming to have ties to higher dimensions and divine wisdom that could save humanity from impending doom. Her followers revered her as the ultimate spiritual authority, often cutting ties with their families and sacrificing their resources to serve the group. The cult operated as an online community, utilizing social media platforms to propagate their pseudo-spiritual ideology and recruit members. Inside Love Has Won, life was far from the harmonious paradise Carlson preached. Members were subjected to extreme control, including strict dietary restrictions, forced isolation, and psychological abuse. The group's teachings were a mix of New Age philosophies and conspiracy theories, but the reality was a toxic environment where Carlson ruled with absolute power. Reports from ex-members describe an atmosphere of fear, where dissent was met with harsh punishments, both emotional and physical. The world outside Love Has Won might never have fully grasped the extent of its dark practices had it not been for an incident in 2021 that shocked even seasoned investigators. Amy Carlson's mummified body was discovered in a Colorado home, eerily adorned with Christmas lights and glitter. Authorities described the scene as bizarre and macabre, and the revelations that followed painted a disturbing picture of the group's decline. Investigations revealed a fractured community grappling with the loss of their leader while attempting to uphold the facade of their movement. Several members were arrested, and Carlson's death brought Love Has Won into the national spotlight. Yet for those who had escaped, the damage, both emotional and financial, was already done, leaving them to rebuild their lives after years of manipulation. From the eerie echoes of Love Has Won, we now move to an earlier era, where an unconventional approach to therapy evolved into a controversial lifestyle of communal living. Number 25. The Sullivanians. In the heart of Manhattan's Upper West Side, during the cultural upheaval of the late 1950s, a bold experiment in communal living began. Founded by Saul B. Newton and Dr. Jane Pierce, the Sullivan Institute for Research in Psychoanalysis set out to challenge the traditional nuclear family, a structure Newton blamed for all societal ills. What began as an avant-garde approach to therapy quickly evolved into a controversial experiment in human connection, intimacy, and control. At its core, the Sullivan Institute promoted radical ideas. Monogamy was forbidden, exclusive relationships were labeled toxic, and members were encouraged, if not pressured, to sever ties with their families. With over 500 members at its peak, the group thrived in its self-contained world, spreading across 3 apartment buildings where members engaged in polyamorous relationships and embraced their so-called liberation. But this liberation came at a cost. Children born within the community were sent away to caretakers or boarding schools, seeing their parents only sporadically. Therapy sessions turned into instruments of control, with boundaries between therapist and patient blurred beyond recognition. Newton, who lacked any formal training in therapy, wielded his influence with little accountability. In the 1970s, the group merged with a progressive theater collective, blending its ideology with artistic expression. However, cracks began to show. In 1979, Fears of environmental disaster prompted the group to relocate to Orlando, following the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown. Yet, the move marked the beginning of the end. Membership declined, internal dissent grew, and by the time Saul Newton died in 1991, the community had disbanded. For those who lived through it, the Sullivanians represented more than just an experiment gone awry. It was a collision of idealism and exploitation, a testament to the vulnerability of those seeking purpose in a chaotic world. As we conclude this exploration into the 25 most dangerous cult groups you never knew existed, one thing becomes clear. Cults are not relics of the past, nor are they confined to obscure corners of the world. They thrive on our collective hopes, fears, and desires, morphing to fit the zeitgeist of each era. From promises of divine enlightenment to pledges of self-empowerment, these groups remind us of the profound human need to belong and the dangers of unchecked power and control. This journey has been more than a recounting of events. It's been a mirror to our society and the vulnerabilities we often overlook. Whether it's the gripping tales of betrayal or the haunting echoes of lives lost, these stories linger in our minds as cautionary tales. If this documentary has resonated with you, if it sparked your curiosity, made you question, or even just captivated you for a moment, don't let the conversation end here. Click the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue to unravel the hidden narratives that shape our world. From untold stories to gripping investigations, there's so much more to explore together. And remember, in a world teeming with complexity and mystery, knowledge is our greatest armor. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next chapter.